Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. This is Lisa Whitehead, and we are looking at the endocrine system in Biology 205 at Illinois Central College. Let's get started. The objectives for today's lecture include to list the functions of the endocrine system, to compare the homeostatic mechanisms of the nervous system with the endocrine system, explain the importance of intercellular communication, and describe the mechanisms that are involved. This includes direct, paracrine, endocrine, and synaptic mechanisms. To correlate the three different classes of hormones and how each affects their function. So this includes amino acid derivatives, peptide hormones, and lipid derivatives. To describe the functional differences between unbound and bound hormones. Describe why a lack of a receptor affects the body's response to hormones. Compare the effect of membrane-bound versus intracellular receptors. Define amplification, receptor cascade, downregulation, and upregulation, and then relate those to hormone reception. Compare simple, complex, and neuroendocrine reflexes. And then last, to describe how each of the following affects endocrine action. This includes hormone concentration, intracellular conditions, the number of receptor molecules, and the duration of exposure. Also, to describe how the hypothalamus integrates the nervous and endocrine systems. Describe the location and structure of the pituitary gland and understand structural and functional relationship with the hypothalamus. Describe the negative feedback mechanism of the hypothalamus and hormone concentration. For example, TRH will trigger the anterior pituitary gland or the adenohypophysis to release TSH. TSH then in turn triggers the thyroid to release T3 and T4. And those T3 and T4 concentrations as they rise will shut off TRH release. For the following hormones, we'd like you to be able to identify the gland or organ that produces the hormone, the location of that gland or organ, the chemical type, so that could be an amino acid, a peptide, or a lipid, and then the receptor type, which could be membrane-bound or intracellular, the hormone target organ, and also the hormone effect. Also, this applies to hormones of the hypothalamus, so this includes thyroid-releasing hormone, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, oxytocin, and antidiuretic hormone. For the anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis, this includes the thyroid-stimulating hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and melanocyte-stimulating hormone. The hormones of the posterior pituitary, which is the neurohypophysis, these are produced actually by hypothalamic neurons, but they're released by the posterior pituitary, which includes oxytocin and ADH. And then also the hormones of the thyroid gland, so T3 and T4 and calcitonin. That also applies for the following, that the parathyroid glands produce parathyroid hormone, the hormones of the adrenal cortex, which includes mineralocorticoids, which is mainly aldosterone, glucocorticoids, which is mainly cortisol, and androgens, that the adrenal medulla produces both epinephrine and norepinephrine, that the pineal gland produces melatonin, that the hormones of the pancreas include insulin and glucagon. For the kidneys, the hormones affected here include erythropoietin, calcitriol, the renin, which is part of the renin-angiotensin system, and so renin is going to trigger the production of angiotensin II. But the heart produces atrial natriuretic peptide or factor and BNP. The thymus produces thymosin. Hormones of the testes include androgens, and then hormones of the ovaries include both estrogen and progesterone. Also determine the antagonistic relationship of hormones. So for example, the antagonistic relationship between calcitonin and PTH. Determine which of the listed hormones utilizes a positive feedback mechanism of action. Describe the location and the structure of the adrenal glands, and understand the functional and structural differences between the cortex and the medulla. Describe the location and structure of the pancreas and its exocrine versus endocrine function. Discuss the results of abnormal levels of pancreatic hormone production. Compare diabetes mellitus type 1 and 2 in regards to their causes and also their ability to reverse the disease. And describe the function of leptin. And then lastly, to describe the stress response and the homeostatic mechanisms regulating the response. Before we get started, I'd like to review with you for a moment the difference between the endocrine system and the nervous system, because both of these systems are responsible for controlling our bodies, but they do so in very different ways. The endocrine system is going to have a slower action than the nervous system, and the reason for this is that the endocrine system is relying on hormones in our bloodstream, which take time to diffuse to get to a certain location to have an effect. The nervous system, by contrast, is fast-acting because action potentials are carried over both myelinated and unmyelinated nerves, and this occurs incredibly quickly. The endocrine system also has a longer duration of its effects, as opposed to the nervous system, which has a shorter duration of its effects. So if you imagine again an action potential, that gets conducted very quickly, and then you have your response, your effector responds immediately, so that lasts just for a short period of time. Whereas the endocrine system, on the other hand, has a much longer duration because those hormones in the bloodstream take time to be diffused or metabolized or any number of other things that are going to happen to those chemicals. So the effects of the endocrine system will persist for a longer period of time. And then lastly, the endocrine system has more diffuse targets, whereas the nervous system has a very specific target. Whether the nervous system is sensing something or sending a motor command, either way, there's a very specific sensor or sensory receptor that senses that feeling. And then similarly, there's a very specific pathway that we've reviewed already of motor activity, and that goes to a very specific effector. In the endocrine system, we have diffuse targets, so hormones that are released into the bloodstream can affect any number of different locations contingent upon the receptors at a variety of different locations. A couple quick caveats though. So first, both the endocrine system and the nervous system will use chemical signals to communicate information. So, for example, ligands, also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. These can be used to communicate from one tissue to another. However, hormones versus neurotransmitters may sometimes use the exact same substance, but they use it in different ways. So a hormone is going to be releasing a chemical into the bloodstream for application at a distal site, whereas a neurotransmitter is going to release its substance immediately adjacent to the next cell, so that way it can immediately affect the next cell over as a neurotransmitter rather than through the bloodstream. Now, both the endocrine system and the nervous system will primarily use negative feedback loops, and they both are operating to maintain homeostasis. These are our two control systems, and they're both trying to just keep everything sailing along like a duck on a pond. In today's lecture, we're going to follow through the organization of the chapter so that way you can follow along, press pause if you need to, and review certain content sections as appropriate for your studying. So first, we're going to discuss how cells communicate between one another, and then we'll move into a more broad conversation about hormones. After that, we're going to go through one after another the major endocrine system glands. So we'll talk about the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, the adrenal glands, and the pineal gland, and then finally the pancreas. Then we're going to wrap up our conversation with discussing some secondary endocrine functions, and then finally some hormone interactions. Figure 18.1 in your text shows you all the different organs that comprise our endocrine system. And as you can see, they are scattered throughout our body in a variety of locations, ranging all the way from our brain to our thoracic cavity, our abdominal pelvic cavity, and also in our gonads. So what you can see here is that the endocrine system produces about 30 different hormones, and these are all chemical messengers that will be released at a certain point to have a message that is extended to a distal second location. And the endocrine system is going to be controlling and coordinating all sorts of body processes. And it does this by using all of these different hormones. So you can see everything that's listed off here, which I won't read to you, but we'll discuss these all in detail in this lecture. There are 4 mechanisms by which cells are able to communicate with one another, and this is called intercellular communication. The first is direct communication, in which we have cells that are adjacent to one another that are able to communicate directly one to the other between 2 cells of the exact same cell type. So for example, 2 of the same types of cells, like 2 muscle cells that are right next to each other, can communicate with one another by exchanging ions and molecules across gap junctions. Now this is a very highly specialized mechanism and is relatively rare. Paracrine communication is when we have chemical signals transferring, and that's from cell to cell, but within a single tissue. In paracrine communication, it doesn't necessarily need to be two cells of the exact same type, but it is within the same tissue. Another mechanism by which cells use to communicate is autocrine communication. And autocrine communication is when we have a cell essentially communicating with itself. And so this is really just a cell muttering under its breath to itself like a crazy person. So they're muttering out a message, and it's going to affect the same cell. So that means that one individual cell can excrete or secrete a specific chemical, and then that chemical will then affect it again only. So for example, prostaglandins are a type of substance that's secreted by smooth muscle cells. And so once the cell secretes that prostaglandin, it will cause itself to contract. And then lastly, the last mechanism is endocrine communication, which is the basis of our discussion today. And that is when we have endocrine cells releasing chemicals that are called hormones into the bloodstream. And so that means that that chemical can then be dispersed throughout the bloodstream, throughout our body, to anywhere the blood will go. And this will affect the metabolic activities of many different organs and many different tissues. The endocrine system relies on target cells, which are the cells that will receive the hormone that is in the bloodstream and respond to it. So the target cells have receptors on them that are specific to the particular hormone, and therefore they can read that hormone and then respond to it and act accordingly. Hormones are going to be able to change the types, the quantities, or the activities of enzymes and structural proteins in target cells. So that means they can change the structure of a cell. So for example, that can affect the permeability of a plasma membrane, or it can also affect specific activities in the cell, ranging from metabolic activities or something like transcription. And all of these things can affect both multiple tissues and organs at the same time, because since the hormones are in the bloodstream, they're going to be able to affect lots of different cells simultaneously. And this will affect things that are long-term processes like growth and development. Synaptic communication is what we discussed in detail in the nervous system in the past several chapters. So this is the process by which neurons communicate with one another by releasing neurotransmitters at a synapse. And so that leads to our action potentials that are able to take messages along very quickly, propagating along axons to reach the specific destination and respond immediately. So as you can imagine, synaptic communication, because of its very fast pace, is able to allow us to respond very quickly in a crisis, like running away from a speeding car if we're crossing at a crosswalk. Table 18.1 shows you a general summary of the different mechanisms of the types of communication. And as you can see, we have the first four listed up top: the direct communication, paracrine communication, autocrine communication, and endocrine communication. And then lastly, we have synaptic communication, which is our neurotransmitters via our nervous system. So the direct communication is going to occur through gap junctions, and that's going to be limited just to cells of the same type. So these are neighbors talking to each other. Paracrine communication is when one cell in the same type of tissue affects nearby tissues through the extracellular fluid. Autocrine communication is again when you have a cell muttering under its breath like a crazy person to itself. So it secretes something through extracellular fluid, and then that affects that exact same cell that secreted the substance in the first place. Endocrine communication is what we're discussing today, when a hormone is released into the bloodstream and affects a target cell in a distal tissue. And then again, synaptic communication, that's our nervous system releasing neurotransmitters, and that will be located to a very specific area in which the target cells have to have the specifically appropriate receptors in order to make this happen. Section 18.2, Hormones. As I mentioned in the very beginning of this lecture, both the endocrine system and the nervous system are going to rely on the release of chemicals that bind specific receptors on target cells. And they share many chemical messengers. So for example, norepinephrine and epinephrine are shared by both the endocrine system and the nervous system. And again, both of these are regulated by negative feedback primarily, and they function to preserve homeostasis. So they try to coordinate and regulate our activities. Under the umbrella of the endocrine system, you'll find all endocrine cells and tissues that will produce hormones or paracrines. And again, paracrines are those specific types of cells that will produce a substance to affect a nearby cell of a different type through extracellular fluid. Endocrine cells will release secretions into the extracellular fluid too, but this is different than the exocrine cells. Exocrine cells will release secretions, but instead of placing it into the extracellular fluid, they'll deposit onto an epithelial-lined surface, which is typically a duct. So anytime you see a duct present, you know that is not the endocrine system, that's probably an exocrine specimen. Also, endocrine organs are going to be scattered throughout the body. Let's discuss some of those now. The endocrine system is dispersed throughout our body, starting with our head in the central nervous system. We have the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland, which release a lot of different very important hormones. And then moving into the neck, you'll see the thyroid gland and the 4 parathyroid glands that are on the back side or posterior surface of the thyroid gland. And as we move into the chest, we have the heart and the thymus. In the abdomen, we have adipose tissue and the digestive tract, as well as the pancreas. And then retroperitoneally, we also have the kidneys and the adrenal glands, which will release a considerable number of hormones. And then lastly, our reproductive organs as well. We have both testes and ovaries, which release a lot of our sex-producing hormones. Hormones can be broken down into 3 separate classes based upon their chemical structure: amino acid derivatives, peptide hormones, and lipid derivatives. Let's look at each of these in a few coming slides. Hormones that are amino acid derivatives are also known as biogenic amines, and these are small molecules that are very closely related and specifically structurally related to amino acids. So some of them are going to be derivatives of tyrosine, and some of them are derivatives of tryptophan. So those that are derivatives of tyrosine include all of our thyroid hormones and catecholamines. The catecholamines include epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. The derivatives of tryptophan will include serotonin and melatonin. As you can see in figure 18.2, there's a nice image of a turkey, because I think most people are familiar with tryptophan being something that is heavily present in turkey, which makes you feel very sleepy after you've had a Thanksgiving dinner. But there are other sources of tryptophan, which are listed here, ranging from things like chocolate to bananas and oats and peanuts, etc., etc. Peptide hormones are chains of amino acids that are mostly synthesized as prohormones. So this means that they're inactive molecules that convert to active hormones either before or after they're secreted. There's also glycoproteins, and these are proteins that are more than 200 amino acids long, and they have a carbohydrate side chain. So for example, TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone are all examples of glycoproteins. And there are also short polypeptides and small proteins. The peptide hormones include some short-chain polypeptides such as antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, and each of these are 9 amino acids long. The small proteins here will include things like insulin, growth hormone, and prolactin. Insulin is 51 amino acids, growth hormone is 191, and prolactin, being the longest, has 198 amino acids. And this includes all the hormones that are secreted by our hypothalamus, the heart, the thymus, the digestive tract, pancreas, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and on it goes. The lipidative derivative hormones are broken down into eicosanoids and steroid hormones. The eicosanoids are going to be derived from arachidonic acid, which is a 20-carbon fatty acid. And these are paracrines that coordinate cellular activities and will affect enzymatic processes, which include things such as blood clotting. Some of our eicosanoids, such as leukotrienes, will have secondary roles as hormones, and leukotrienes are really inflammatory mediators. Prostaglandins are going to coordinate our local cellular activities, and these can be converted to thromboxanes and prostacyclins in some tissues. Prostaglandins are really important for dealing with all sorts of injury and illness because they control things such as inflammation, blood flow, and the formation of blood clots. Our steroid hormones, which are also a lipid derivative, are derived from cholesterol. So therefore, remember, not all cholesterol is bad. It not only creates structure in our plasma membranes of our cells, but it also helps us produce steroid hormones. So these include things like androgens that are produced from the testes in males, and estrogens and progesterone are produced from the ovaries in females. Corticosteroids will be created from the adrenal cortex, and calcitriol will be created from the kidneys. So these will all be bound to specific transport proteins in the plasma, and they'll circulate for longer than the peptide hormones will. Hormones are usually going to be released where there are a lot of capillaries, so that way there is a lot of space for them to be taken up into the bloodstream so that they can circulate. So they'll circulate pretty freely, or they'll travel bound to some other special carrier protein, but they'll be in the bloodstream for a while. And the free hormones are going to stay functional for just under an hour, and they're inactivated when one of three different things happens. Whenever they diffuse out of the bloodstream and then bind to a receptor on a target cell so they can actually do what they're supposed to do, or they can be absorbed and broken down by the liver and kidneys, or alternatively, they could also be broken down by enzymes in the blood or in the interstitial fluids. Now, interestingly, our thyroid and steroid hormones are going to stay functional much longer in our bloodstream. So more than 99% of our thyroid and steroid hormones will become attached to a special transport protein in the blood. And there's an equilibrium state in between the free and the bound forms, so that the bloodstream is going to contain a reserve of bound hormones in the event that we use up a number of our free hormones. When a hormone binds with this target cell, there are three different mechanisms by which a hormone can affect that target cell. So the first is that the hormone can affect the genetic activity of the target cell. So this means that the hormone can activate specific genes in the cell. Also, the hormone could alter the rate of protein synthesis. So this means that the hormone is going to either increase or decrease the rate of transcription or translation. And the third thing is that the hormone could also change the membrane permeability. So that means that any enzyme or membrane channel, for example, could be either turned on or off, and so that changes its shape or structure. A hormone receptor is a protein molecule to which a particular molecule will bind. And different tissues are going to have all different combinations of different types of receptors. And so the presence or absence of a specific receptor is what is going to determine how sensitive a specific cell is to a specific hormone. The absence or presence of a hormone also affects how hormone receptor proteins work. So they can either be downregulated or upregulated. So downregulated is when there's a specific hormone present that will trigger a decrease in the number of hormone receptors present. So, for example, when a specific hormone level gets too high, the cells just become less sensitive to it and just kind of ignore it. Now, alternatively, we have upregulation, in which the absence of a hormone triggers an increase in the number of hormone receptors. So, when the levels of a specific hormone are low, then the cells become much more sensitive to that particular hormone. The catecholamines and peptide hormones are not lipid soluble. So what that means is they're unable to penetrate the plasma membrane. So instead, they have to bind to receptor proteins on the outer surface of the plasma membrane. So these are called extracellular receptors because they have to bind to the extracellular surface. Now, steroid and thyroid hormones are lipid soluble. So lipid soluble things can diffuse across the plasma membrane. So the receptors for lipid soluble steroid and thyroid hormones are actually inside the cell. So these are called intracellular receptors. The mechanism by which a hormone communicates with a cell is by using first and second messengers. So the first messenger is whenever we have a hormone that's going to bind to the extracellular receptor. And this promotes the release of the second messenger in the cell. So the second messenger is an intermediary molecule. And what it does is it acts as an enzyme activator or an inhibitor or a cofactor. And the result is that it changes the rate of metabolic functions. So examples of this include CAMP, CGMP, or calcium. When just a few hormone molecules bind to extracellular receptors, what happens is we'll see that there are even thousands of second messengers that appear. And this has the effect of magnifying the hormone on the target cell. This process is called amplification. G proteins play an important role because they are an enzyme complex that is coupled to the membrane receptor. So proteins will bind GTP, and they're involved in the link between the first messenger and the second messenger. So just by the way, there's a note in your text that roughly 80% of prescription drugs will target receptors coupled to G proteins. So that means that G proteins are going to be the mediator that carries a specific substance, so that way our cells can respond to it. Adenosine triphosphate is the energy currency of the cell. And AMP is going to be a precursor of this, because remember that AMP is adenosine monophosphate and ATP is adenosine triphosphate. So the steps involved in increasing the cAMP level, which will accelerate the metabolic activity of the cell, include the following. Activated G proteins are going to activate adenylate cyclase, and then that adenylate cyclase can convert ATP to cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP then can function as a second messenger, and then generally we're going to see that cyclic AMP will activate kinases, and those kinases will then phosphorylate proteins. The increase that we see in cAMP levels is usually pretty short-lived, and this is because phosphodiesterase, or PDE, will convert cAMP to AMP. Activated G proteins will either trigger the opening of calcium channels in the plasma membrane or allow for calcium ions to be released from the intracellular aspect of the cell. So, G proteins will activate phospholipase C, also abbreviated PLC, and this triggers receptors that will cascade beginning with the production of diacylglycerol, or DAG, which is easier to use the acronym for sure, and inositol triphosphate, which is IP3, from phospholipids. IP3 can then diffuse into the cytoplasm, and once it's into the cytoplasm, it will trigger the release of calcium from the intracellular reserves of calcium. So the calcium ion channels then will open because of the activation of protein kinase C, or abbreviated PKC, and therefore calcium can then enter the cell. That calcium that's entering the cell then will bind to calmodulin, and this will activate a number of enzymes. One of the ways that hormones affect cells is by affecting gene activation. So, hormones and intracellular receptors together can alter the rate of DNA transcription in the nucleus. And the alterations in the synthesis of either enzymes or of structural proteins will directly affect the activity and the structure of the target cell. Thyroid hormones, like steroid hormones, are lipid-soluble, and because of this, both of them will be able to diffuse through the plasma membrane. So once they're through the plasma membrane, then they're able to bind to receptors. So they typically will bind to receptors on the nucleus and also on the mitochondria. So because of where they're binding, think of what happens in these organelles. In mitochondria, we have ATP production, right? The powerhouse of the cell. And in the nucleus, we have genetic reproduction occurring. So what could these possibly do? Well, when these thyroid hormones bind to receptors on the mitochondria, they'll increase rates of ATP production. And when the thyroid hormones bind to receptors on the nucleus, they can either activate genes or change the rate of transcription. Hormone secretion, which is essentially just endocrine activity, is going to be controlled primarily by negative feedback. So what that means is if there's a stimulus present that triggers the production of a hormone, the direct or indirect effects will be to reduce the intensity of the substance. So hormone secretion can be triggered by three things, either by humoral stimuli, which is a change in the constitution of the extracellular fluid, or hormonal stimuli, so whether we have either a high level or a low level of a specific hormone, or thirdly, neural stimuli, the presence or absence of specific neurotransmitters. Hormone secretion can be controlled by a number of different things, and sometimes involves only one hormone. But each of the different stimuli will affect different hormones and how they are produced and secreted. So for example, humoral stimuli will affect hormone secretion by our heart, the pancreas, the parathyroid gland, and the digestive tract. The hormonal stimuli can have one or more intermediary steps, and in the hormonal stimuli case, sometimes two or even more than that hormones can be involved at the same time. Neural stimuli, however, will be like the biggest thing of all because the hypothalamus oversees everything, so it provides the highest level of control of all of our hormones. Pop quiz time. Which hormones can diffuse into the cell to control the cellular activities from the inside? Peptides, proteins, or lipids? Well, we know right off the bat that peptides and proteins are not lipid soluble, and only the option C is lipid, which is lipid soluble. So only lipid soluble substances can cross a plasma membrane by diffusion. So therefore we know A and B are out and C is the correct answer. So proteins and peptides will have to have a different mechanism. These have to have extracellular receptors as opposed to intracellular receptors. Now let's look at section 18.3, the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, or hypophysis, is known as our master gland because it secretes 9 different peptide hormones. So where is it first? Well, it's within the sella turcica, which means Turkish saddle. So it's resting comfortably in this little space. And there is bone underneath it, the sphenoid, which allows for it to be housed safely. And it dangles in there, hung by the stalk called the infundibulum, which connects to the hypothalamus. So it hangs just inferior to the hypothalamus. You'll notice in figure 18.5 that there are 2 blue spots on either side of the infundibulum, and these are going to be important to separate the pituitary gland from the cranial cavity, and that's called the sellar diaphragm. The pituitary gland itself releases 9 different peptide hormones, and these bind to extracellular receptors using cAMP as a second messenger. Figure 18.5 shows you the anatomy of the pituitary gland. So on the left, we have a schematic of the pituitary gland in general, and then on the right, we have light microscopy imaging. So on the left, let's take a look, and you'll see that there's a square right in the center, and that square is correlating over to the image on the right in light microscopy to show you what it looks like under a microscope. So the anterior part of the pituitary is in pink, and then you can see that there's a spot in between the anterior and the posterior aspects in blue, and then the posterior pituitary lobe is kind of a tan with some pink stripes. So if you look over onto the right at the light microscopy, we're zooming in at 77 power. And what we see here is the division between the anterior and the posterior pituitary lobe. And they have different histology and different functions because function follows structure. So what we have on the left is the anterior pituitary lobe broken down into the pars distalis and the pars intermedia. And then on the right, we have the posterior pituitary lobe, which you can see is much lighter in color than both the pars intermedia and the pars distalis. So the posterior pituitary lobe will be releasing ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, whereas the anterior pituitary lobe is responsible for secreting a number of other hormones. The hypothalamus has an important role to play in regulating the pituitary gland. So even though the pituitary gland is our master gland, the hypothalamus is the brains of the operation, literally in our brains. So it will regulate the function of the pituitary gland and synthesizes antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, and then it sends them to the posterior pituitary gland so that way they can be released into the circulation there. It also secretes regulatory hormones, and what these do is they'll control how much is produced by the anterior pituitary gland. So it's the hypothalamus that's really telling the anterior pituitary gland what to do, and then they send their own product for shipping out through the posterior of the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus also contains autonomic centers that will exert control over the adrenal medulla. So on the right, you see an image of the adrenal medulla, and via preganglionic motor fibers, you can see that they will arrive at the adrenal medulla, and the adrenal medulla is then able to secrete its product, specifically epinephrine and norepinephrine. The anterior lobe of our pituitary gland is called the adenohypophysis. And in figure 18.5, you can see again that we have the pink in the front, and that is our adenohypophysis. So in the adenohypophysis, we have hormones here that will turn on endocrine glands or support the functions of other organs throughout our body. The adenohypophysis has three specific regions that we looked at microscopically before: the pars distalis, the pars tuberalis, and the pars intermedia. So the pars tuberalis, as you can see in figure 18.5, is tube-like, so it wraps around the infundibulum. So you can see the pink up at the stalk of the pituitary gland wrapping around, and that is our pars tuberalis. The pars distalis is the most distal part of the anterior pituitary lobe, so it is the most anterior part. And then in the middle, we have the intermediate part, the pars intermedia. If you look at figure 18.5 again, if you look just superior to the infundibulum, you'll see a tan area that's labeled the median eminence. And what this is a swelling that's near the attachment of the infundibulum, and this is where the hypothalamic neurons will release their hormones into the interstitial fluid. So at this point, then the hormones from the hypothalamus can enter the bloodstream through capillaries that are in the pituitary gland. And these are fenestrated capillaries, and fenestra is Latin for window. Portal vessels are blood vessels that will link two capillary networks together. So typically what we have are arteries that will carry oxygenated blood away from the heart and veins which will carry deoxygenated blood towards the heart. But portal vessels will link capillary networks together. So this is called a portal system. And specifically in the pituitary gland, we have something called the hypophyseal portal system, in which we have capillary systems mixing. And this is really important because we have regulatory hormones coming down from the hypothalamus. And they are sending regulatory hormones that need to contact the entire anterior pituitary, so that way the anterior pituitary can actually release what it should in response to those regulatory hypothalamic hormones. So because we have this hypophyseal portal system, it really means that we're able to have all of those hypothalamic hormones enter the adenohypophysis and then be able to allow the adenohypophysis to release its product, because otherwise, if it didn't mix properly with the entire adenohypophysis first, then what would happen is those hypothalamic hormones could enter the bloodstream and they would have to go downstream, circulate throughout the whole entire body. During that time, they could be, in any number of ways, disengaged, so they're unable to do what they're supposed to do, and therefore not affect the adenohypophysis effectively. So this hypophyseal portal system ensures that the hypothalamic hormones are able to affect the adenohypophysis and the neurohypophysis effectively. The hypothalamus controls the anterior lobe via regulatory hormones, but it also uses the posterior lobe as a highway by which to pass out their product. So there are releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones that come from the hypothalamus that affect the anterior lobe or the adenohypophysis. The releasing hormones will stimulate the synthesis and secretion of one or more hormones in the anterior lobe, whereas the inhibiting hormones are exactly the opposite. They're going to prevent the synthesis and secretion of hormones from that same adenohypophysis. And in both cases, the rate of secretion is going to be controlled by negative feedback loops. Figure 18.8 is going to break down for you how this all works. So let's start at the top. The hypothalamus, which is the brains of the operation, will be telling the pituitary gland what to do, so the pituitary hormones can then in turn affect our endocrine organs. So let's start in the second column that you see here. So TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone, is released from the hypothalamus. So upon release to the hypothalamus, it'll come down to the pituitary gland and stimulate the pituitary gland to produce thyroid stimulating hormone. So that thyroid stimulating hormone does exactly what it sounds like. It stimulates the thyroid to release its hormones, right? So it stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones throughout the whole body. Let's move over one more column to CRH. So what we have here is corticotropin releasing hormone being released from the hypothalamus. So when it arrives at the pituitary gland, that produces ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, which adrenal gland, cortico is the cortex, tropic is producing. So ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, is telling the adrenal cortex to produce its hormone, and its hormones are glucocorticoids. And then in the last column, what we have is gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which then comes down to the pituitary gland, and then it will either affect FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, or LH, luteinizing hormone. So both of these are affected by gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and dependent upon whether it's affecting testes or ovaries, it'll have different outcomes. So FSH affecting testes will produce inhibin, whereas FSH affecting ovaries in a female will produce inhibin and also the production of estrogens. LH, or luteinizing hormone, will be produced by gonadotropin-releasing hormone also, and it will either affect testes or ovaries differentially as well. So the testes will then produce androgens, and ovaries will then, in response to the luteinizing hormone, produce progesterone or estrogens. The hormones of the anterior lobe include thyroid-stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid to release its hormones, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, which, of course, just like its name, tells the adrenal cortex to release its hormone. And this is caused by, from the thalamus, CRH, or corticotropin-releasing hormone. Prolactin, abbreviated PRL, and this release is going to be inhibited by prolactin-inhibiting hormone, or the release could be also stimulated by prolactin-releasing hormone. There's also growth hormone, which is also known as somatotropin, and gonadotropins as well. The gonadotropins are hormones produced by our gonads, and this includes the following: our follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and in females, luteinizing hormone is particularly important because this spikes right before ovulation, which triggers ovulation, and also stimulates the secretion of estrogens and progesterone. And progesterone is particularly important in being able to maintain a placenta and therefore maintain a pregnancy. In males, though, luteinizing hormone has a different role. It stimulates the production of androgens. Now, the production of FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone, is stimulated by gonadotropin-releasing hormone. Hypogonadism, by the way, is a clinical correlation of importance because this can be caused by low production of gonadotropins, and hypogonadism can be a common cause of infertility. Figure 18.9 shows you again how this all shakes down. So the hypothalamus is going to control the pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland is going to release all of these different hormones which have far-reaching implications throughout our body. In purple, you're going to see highlighted all of the different substances that are secreted by the adenohypophysis, or anterior pituitary gland. And this starts with ACTH, the adrenocorticotropic hormone. So this stimulates the adrenal gland to release its cortical substances. But something to note here, by the way, is that remember that we have direct control of the nervous system, by the nervous system to the adrenal medulla to release the products epinephrine and norepinephrine because of their incredible utility in crisis situations. However, the adrenal cortex will produce things like cortisol and corticosterone, and these are glucocorticoids. The adenohypophysis also releases TSH, a thyroid-stimulating hormone, to stimulate the thyroid to release its thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. Growth hormone will also stimulate the liver to produce somatomedins, and this will affect our growth of our bone, our muscles, and other tissues that allow us to actually become larger in physical stature. PRL, or prolactin, will affect our mammary glands. FSH and LH, of course, have reproductive applications to the testes and the ovaries, producing a number of sex hormones. And then you'll see there's a little gray tan area, and that is the pars intermedia. And we're seeing here MSH highlighted, which is melanocyte-stimulating hormone. And we're uncertain what this means clinically in healthy adults, but it does stimulate melanocytes. And then lastly, our posterior pituitary gland, or neurohypophysis, releases antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Figure 18.8 also shows you a variation on the way that our endocrine system is regulated. So we think about things being stimulated, but also we have to remember that things have to turn off too, right? So we have both stimulating and inhibiting actions occurring simultaneously. So when one hits the gas, the other hits the brake, and vice versa. So if you've driven a standard or a stick or manual or whatever you call it here in the States, basically you know that you're going to have, if your foot on the gas, then you're going to be lifting up off the other pedal. Or if you're taking your foot off the gas, you're putting your other foot back onto the clutch. And so this is a similar sort of idea here. So what you have going on is, in this case, we have prolactin, which is responsible for stimulating our mammary glands, and it is produced by the anterior lobe, or the adenohypophysis, our anterior pituitary gland. So there's both PIH, which inhibits, and PRH, which stimulates. And so we have both of these substances working in opposition to be able to balance out, so that way we're able to both start lactation and stop lactation. Otherwise, it would just be a constant leaky mess. Growth hormone has a role in stimulating the liver, so that way our hepatocytes, or liver cells, can release somatomedins, and these will stimulate tissue growth. Somato, again, meaning body, so somatomedins will cause skeletal muscle fibers as well as other cells in our body to increase their uptake of amino acids. Also, it triggers stem cells in our epithelia and in our connective tissues to divide. So this is how we produce size and bulk. Growth hormone will also stimulate the breakdown of triglycerides in adipocytes. So this is leading to something called a glucose-sparing effect. And the breakdown of glycogen in liver cells will cause something called a diabetogenic effect, which is basically when we increase the blood glucose concentration much higher than it should be beyond normal. So in this case, this is something worth noting clinically. People who sometimes take things such as steroids for purposes of becoming bulky and muscular, this can include growth hormone taken as an extrinsic drug for recreational purposes. And when people take growth hormone, a number of things will happen that are considerably undesirable, but one of which is the diabetogenic effect. Growth hormone, as you already know, is produced by the adenohypophysis, but there's also both the ability to turn this on and to dial it back. And so this is via growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And these play an important role in turning on and turning off the application of growth hormone. Okay, so now that we've discussed the anterior lobe in detail, the pars intermedia, so this is the intermediate part in between the anterior component and the posterior lobe. So the pars intermedia will be secreting melanocyte-stimulating hormone, which of course, like it sounds, stimulates melanin production from melanocytes. Now this is something that's really non-functional in adults, except for in two cases, people with very specific diseases or also women who are pregnant. The posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which is called the neurohypophysis, is called the neurohypophysis because it contains unmyelinated axons from the hypothalamus. So the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei will create, respectively, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, meaning the supraoptic nuclei manufactures antidiuretic hormone and the paraventricular nuclei manufacture oxytocin. Oxytocin has a ton of application in our lives, ranging from stimulating the contraction of the uterus during labor so that way a delivery can occur, and it also allows for the ejection of milk after delivery. So it doesn't produce milk, but it allows for the letdown of milk. Figure 18.9 shows you how the hypothalamus directly releases hormones into the capillary network or the portal network of the pituitary gland. And it does this via the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland or the neurohypophysis. So these two hormones directly include ADH or antidiuretic hormone and OXT or oxytocin. So ADH, antidiuretic, does exactly what you think it does in the kidneys, and oxytocin is responsible for, as we've discussed in females, uterine contractions and mammary gland contractions, but in males, oxytocin is responsible for smooth muscle in the ductus deferens and also in the prostate gland. Figure 18.9 shows you the whole schematic here of how the hypothalamus, being the brains of the operation, is able to affect the pituitary gland and therefore many different parts throughout our body. So the hypothalamus, through indirect control through the release of regulatory hormones, affects the anterior or adenohypophysis, whereas it directly releases hormones via the posterior through the portal network, and that includes antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. So there is both an indirect approach here and a direct approach. And the direct approach is specifically through the posterior, and the indirect approach is specifically through the anterior. But also keep in mind, something we haven't touched on here because we discussed it in previous lectures. Do not forget, though, that the nervous system can directly control the adrenal gland, specifically to have it release epinephrine and norepinephrine through the adrenal medulla. So pop quiz question. Which of the following hormones are produced by the posterior pituitary? A, oxytocin, B, adrenocorticotropic hormone, C, antidiuretic hormone, or D, none of the above? Well, we just studied this pretty carefully, so I'm pretty sure almost 100% of you listening will know that both oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone are produced by the neurohypophysis or the posterior pituitary through direct involvement with the pituitary gland, whereas adrenocorticotropic hormone is indirectly created via the relationship from the anterior pituitary via the hypothalamus. Which hormone is responsible for milk letdown? A, oxytocin, B, prolactin, C, estrogen, or D, none of the above? Well, let's rule out none of the above because we know that one of the three here has to be it. Estrogen has a lot of important roles in our reproductive function, but milk letdown is not one of them. Oxytocin and prolactin both have an incredibly important role in lactation. Prolactin is responsible for the development of milk, whereas oxytocin is the hormone that is specifically responsible for milk letdown. So the answer is A. Next, let's move to section 18.4, the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland looks basically like a butterfly lying just below the thyroid cartilage of our larynx, and it has two specific lobes, the left and the right, and these are connected in the middle by something called an isthmus. And inside the thyroid gland, we have thyroid follicles. And these follicles are spheres lined with cuboidal epithelium, which you don't get to see too often. And these are surrounded by capillaries. The thyroid follicles have cells that will absorb iodide ions from the blood, which is important because this is why we have iodized salt in our diet to prevent things like goiters. And also we have follicle cavities, and in these follicle cavities we'll have this viscous colloid that is kind of gelatinous, like a jello, more or less. We also have something called C cells, and the C stands for clear because this is the way they look microscopically, and they're also known as parafollicular cells. Figure 1810 gives you the gross anatomy overview of how the thyroid is in situ. So as you can see, it's got the two different lobes, the left and the right, and in the center, we have something that pokes up a little bit that's called the pyramidal lobe. That's outside of the scope of this class, but pyramidal meaning pyramid-like. And so the isthmus is what is going to connect the right and left lobes, so it's all one continuous structure that is kind of arbitrarily broken down into right and left. So you can see here that we have the superior thyroid artery, which is going to be responsible for supplying the artery. We also have the middle thyroid vein coming off on both sides, and the inferior thyroid artery, which is responsible for providing oxygenated blood to the inferior poles of the thyroid lobes. So you can see that the way that this rests is just medial to both the veins and arteries of the neck that are the large ones, the jugular and the carotid arteries. Figure 1810 shows you light microscopy of the thyroid gland. So on standard H&E, or hematoxylin eosin stain, this is what you would see in a healthy thyroid gland. So you see all of these nice C cells, this cuboidal epithelium, and remember the cuboidal epithelium is when we have cytoplasm that is basically more or less like a square, and then the nucleus is going to take up pretty much the majority of the cytoplasm. So as opposed to squamous, which are squashed flat, or columnar cells, which are tall, you can see that these are all pretty square little guys lined up in a row. So this is a healthy-looking thyroid, and the big structures that you see in the center are the thyroid follicles containing colloid. Here's another image of the thyroid gland showing you the anatomy both in terms of a schematic on the left and light microscopy on the right. So on the left you can see the schematic showing you the follicular cavities containing colloid, and then we have all of those little cuboidal epithelium cells lining the colloid. And then off to the side of the cuboidal epithelium, you're going to see these little cells called C cells. And these are called C cells because they are in fact clear. In the thyroid, the follicular cells will create a protein called thyroglobulin, and this is a globular protein, hence thyroglobulin. And it's secreted into the colloid of those thyroid follicles. So that's inside the follicular cavities that look like lakes. This contains the amino acid tyrosine, which is the building block of all of our thyroid hormones. So the major thyroid hormones include thyroxine and triiodothyronine, or T4 and T3. That's a whole lot easier, and pretty much everybody just says T4 and T3. So T4 will contain 4 iodine atoms, and T3 contains 3 iodine atoms. So because we're breaking down our thyroid hormones per the number of iodine atoms, it should lend you to the idea right away that iodine obviously is a very important component of our thyroid hormones, and in fact is synthesized based off of the iodine that we consume. So this is one of the reasons why we have iodized salt. Figure 1811 shows you the breakdown of how we synthesize and regulate our thyroid hormones. So first off, we have to ingest iodine in the form of iodide ions from the food we eat. So typically, salt is a really great form of this. So those iodide ions will then be delivered to the thyroid gland via the bloodstream. So once they reach the bloodstream, they'll diffuse to the apical surface of the follicular cells, and then they get converted into an atom of iodine, so that's labeled I with a 0 above it in superscript. The tyrosine then will then bind to the iodine atoms. The iodine-containing tyrosine will then have molecules that become linked to the thyroid hormones T3 and T4. The follicular cells around those lakes of colloid will be able to remove thyroglobulin from the follicles by a process of endocytosis. Lysosomal enzymes then come into the factor here, and they'll break down thyroglobulin, and the amino acids there and the thyroid hormones will be able to enter the cytoplasm. Finally, we have T3 and T4 diffused out from the follicular cell into the bloodstream, and the majority of those T3 and T4 molecules will be able to bind to transport proteins. Figure 1811 gives you an example of how homeostasis is maintained via the endocrine system. So in this example, we are looking at a stimulus of either T3 or T4 concentrations dropping in the blood or body temperature becoming too low. So in either one of these cases, what will happen is the hypothalamus will then send a message to the anterior lobe of the pituitary, or adenohypophysis, via thyrotropic releasing hormone. So it sends thyrotropic releasing hormone to the anterior lobe, and then what happens is the anterior lobe responds by producing thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid gland, which is our effector, to release T3 and T4. It's two products. So once the thyroid gland releases T3 and T4, that causes both an increase in the blood concentrations of T3 and T4, as well as the body temperature rising. So then we have restored homeostasis in the body via this mechanism. So this is clearly a negative feedback loop. Thyroid binding globulins, or TBGs, are going to be proteins that bind to thyroid hormones. So they will bind to about 75% of T4 and about 70% of T3. So the vast majority is going to be absorbed by these thyroid binding globulins. But the remainder of it is going to be bound by transthyretin and albumin. However, there is still some T3 and T4 which will remain unbound in the body, and that can diffuse into tissues. And this is a very small percentage. So there's only like 0.3% of T3 and 0.03% of T4 that will remain unbound. In absence of thyroid stimulating hormone, the thyroid follicles can become inactive. And so if they're inactive, nothing is happening. They're just sitting there. So they're not synthesizing thyroid hormones, and they're not secreting the thyroid hormones either. So thyroid stimulating hormone binds to plasma membrane receptors, and this activates key enzymes in thyroid hormone production. Our thyroid hormones affect nearly every cell in our entire body, and they enter our target cells all by a transport system. They'll bind to receptors in several different places, both in the cytoplasm, on the surfaces of mitochondria in the cell, and in the nucleus. And in children, this is incredibly important. It's essential to the normal development of their skeletal, muscular, and nervous systems. Additionally, Thyroid hormones will go to their target cell, and when there, they'll activate genes that are involved in glycolysis and ATP production. So if these cells are going to be potentially upregulating their ATP production, what this does is it results in something called a calorogenic effect, which is the generations of calories, which is heat. So it increases the energy consumption as well as the heat that is generated by those particular cells. So as a result of that, it burns more calories in our body, which is one of the reasons why when you see somebody who has hyperthyroid or an overactive thyroid gland, they may lose weight. And then when they actually have their thyroid gland removed because of any number of reasons, typically a goiter, then if they don't have supplementation, they would have a hypothyroid, which would actually result in the gaining of weight. So this calorogenic effect is responsible for our immediate response to be able to increase our cellular metabolic rate. This is a strong, very quick, and impactful response, but it is short-lived. The C cells of the thyroid, which are those cells that are kind of off to the side of the main cuboidal cells around the colloid. Those C cells, clear cells, produce calcitonin. So C cells are clear and produce calcitonin. Think of all those C's going together. So this calcitonin, though, is incredibly important because it does three things. It helps to regulate the concentration of calcium in our body fluids, and then it can stimulate calcium excretion by the kidneys so we can get rid of excess calcium, and it will also prevent calcium absorption by the digestive tract in order to allow us to not absorb too much. So in summary, the effects of thyroid hormones are pretty broad throughout our entire body. So thyroid hormones will start off by elevating our oxygen and energy consumption. And this can have a very important role in children because a rise in body temperature in children might be the difference between them becoming hypothermic if exposed to a little bit too much of a cool temperature. And as we know, children aren't always able to articulate exactly what they need. So we have a built-in physiologic mechanism to protect children, but this doesn't persist into adulthood. Thyroid hormones will also increase our heart rate and the strength of our contractions, and that sends blood out to our distal areas. Also, it increases the sensitivity of our bodies to sympathetic stimulation. Thyroid hormones also help to maintain the normal sensitivity of our respiratory centers, and this allows us to maintain oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations that are within normal limits. Thyroid hormones also stimulate red blood cell formation, as well as stimulate activity in other endocrine tissues in our bodies. And probably most importantly, our thyroid hormones are responsible for helping to turn over minerals in bone more quickly. I know you haven't studied the skeletal system yet. This comes up in 206, but just in short, the skeletal system is constantly going to be both turning over minerals of bone, specifically calcium, so that way we are constantly building bone and breaking bone down. And ideally, that rate has to be just calibrated perfectly so that way everything maintains its structural integrity. Section 18.5, the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands have an incredibly important role in the endocrine system, but they're probably the smallest component of our endocrine system. So each individual parathyroid gland is going to be about the size of a pea at most, and altogether they weigh 1.6 grams. This is not much. So these two pairs are set up so that way two are more superior and two are more inferior, and they're all on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. But they have variable locations. They're not always exactly as you see in this image. They can be located way up at the very most superior tip of the superior pole of the thyroid, or even in soft tissue somewhere nearby. So locating them can be tricky occasionally. So parathyroid hormone, or parathormone, which is secreted by the principal cells of the parathyroid gland, will be secreting their product whenever they are responding to low concentrations of calcium in the blood. This also allows for them to function as an antagonist for calcitonin. Figure 18.12 shows you the histology of a parathyroid gland. So in the top image, you see a parathyroid gland in total, except we're missing part of the top of it. As you can see, it's cut off by the image. But there's a connective tissue capsule that goes all the way around the parathyroid gland. And then inside the parathyroid gland, you're going to see a blood vessel at the very center that's indicated by the schematic. And then you'll zoom in on a box to look at that bottom image, which is labeled C. And so when you zoom in at a more cellular level, you can see that there are two populations of cells. We have the darker looking cells, and then you have these like larger looking cells that have more cytoplasm and more pale nuclei. So the larger cells with the pale nuclei and the pale cytoplasm are oxyphil cells. And these really have an unknown importance in the body. But the main cells of the parathyroid gland are those darker cells that you see pretty much everywhere in the bottom image. Those are the principal cells of the parathyroid gland, and these are the ones that produce parathyroid hormone or parathormone. The parathyroid glands and the parathyroid hormone that's produced by the parathyroid glands is what is responsible primarily for maintaining adequate blood calcium level. Keep in mind, of course, that the thyroid gland has an important role to play, but if ever asked, the most important component of maintaining our blood calcium level is the parathyroid glands. So first off, what they do is they stimulate osteoclasts. And so osteoclasts are important for breaking down existing bone. So osteoclasts will accelerate mineral turnover, and therefore when the osteoclasts break down existing bone, it releases calcium from the bone into the bloodstream. The other thing parathormone can do is it enhances the reabsorption of calcium by the kidneys, and so it reduces our urinary loss of calcium, so we can hold on to more calcium. So parathormone is both freeing up calcium from our bones and then also being able to hold on to it by not letting the kidneys excrete it. And then lastly, parathormone also will stimulate the formation and secretion of calcitriol by the kidneys. I love figure 1813 because it lays out for you exactly what the role is in the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands and how together they help to maintain homeostasis in regards to our blood calcium levels. So let's start off on the left. You can see in red we have two boxes showing that homeostasis is disturbed either by increasing blood calcium or decreasing the blood calcium level. So let's first look at the top example. Homeostasis disturbed by increasing blood calcium level. So in that event, then that is our stimulus. So the response is that the receptors in the C cells will detect that we actually have a high calcium level in our blood. So as a result, those C cells will be able to secrete calcitonin. Remember, those are our clear C cells secreting calcitonin. And when they secrete calcitonin, the effect on that on the kidneys and digestive tract is such that it increases the excretion of calcium by the kidneys, so we can get rid of some of that excess calcium by urination. And it will decrease the production of calcitriol by the kidneys, and so that also helps to decrease the calcium absorption by the digestive tract. So we're not taking any more in through food that we're eating. So in that pathway, this is how we're going to restore homeostasis via our thyroid gland because of an elevated blood calcium level. So now the opposite is true using the parathyroid glands in the other direction. So let's look at if homeostasis is disturbed by decreasing the blood calcium level. So if our calcium level in our blood is too low, we need more, right? So in the event that we need more, what happens is the receptors in the principal cells in our parathyroid glands will then secrete parathormone or parathyroid hormone. And the effect of this is that the kidneys, bone, and digestive tract can respond in three different ways, respectively. The kidneys can reabsorb more calcium, and then the calcium can be released from the bone because of those osteoclasts. And then also the digestive tract will produce increased calcitriol from the kidneys, causing calcium absorption to be increased by the digestive tract. So everything we eat, we can absorb more of it. So in that case, those three steps together will restore our homeostasis to return our blood calcium level to normal. So please take some time to review this image. It's figure 1813 in your text, and be clear on how an increased blood calcium level is resolved via the thyroid gland and a decreased blood calcium level is resolved through the parathyroid glands. Now let's discuss the adrenal glands, section 18.6. The adrenal glands are named after exactly what their location is. Ad meaning above or up, and renal meaning kidney. So these are glands that literally lie on the superior aspect of each kidney bilaterally. So we'll look at adrenal glands in terms of their cortex and the medulla, which is really just the outer part and the inner part. So the cortex is going to be creating steroid hormones called corticosteroids. Cortico meaning cortex with the Latin connecting O, and then steroids. So Cortical steroids is another way to look at it, come from the cortex of the adrenal gland. And these steroid hormones are going to be produced by lipids, specifically from cholesterol and fatty acids. Now, the inner aspect, the adrenal medulla, is going to be controlled by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, because this is the area of the adrenal gland that produces epinephrine and norepinephrine, and both of these are called catecholamines. Figure 1814 gives you a general look at where they are in our bodies. So recall that the kidneys are retroperitoneal organs that are not a part of our abdominal pelvic cavity. And so you can see that they are nestled in posteriorly, and the adrenal glands are those yellow, looking like adipose tissue type things that are sitting right on top of the superior pole of each of our kidneys. And in this case, in this image, they look like they're kind of triangular, although in all honesty, if you want to be a little more specific, the left adrenal gland is a little more of a semi-lunar shape. But nonetheless, here they are. You can see in the B part of this image that the cortex has this thickened area that's kind of yellow, and the medulla looks like it's mostly connective tissue and a bunch of blood vessels. We're going to look at this in a little bit more detail coming up. But another thing I'd like you to just take a quick note of is if you look at the vascular supply to the adrenal glands as well as the vascular supply to the kidneys, we have our renal arteries and renal veins, and look how large they are. They are really important. They supply a lot of blood to our kidneys because they are very active organs, and you can see the way that those blood vessels, specifically the arteries, the way they branch out in this image is shown very nicely to give you the idea of there are multiple points of freshly oxygenated blood that will approach our kidneys so that way they can be working properly. Now, some of these blood vessels come right off of the aorta to support the adrenal gland, but there are also some that branch off of the right and left renal arteries, as you can see in the instance of the right inferior adrenal artery, and you can see how it's popping right off of the right renal artery. So basically, we've got a lot of different supplies of blood to the adrenal gland, and there's a reason for this. The adrenal glands are incredibly important. Without them, we would die. So we need to be absolutely positive that they have blood supply and that something as simple as a clot can't just basically call off the whole parade. The adrenal cortex, which is the outer aspect of the adrenal gland, is broken down into 3 zones based upon their function and histologic appearance. And so there are 3, the outer, the middle, and the inner. The outer is called the zona glomerulosa, and is given that name because of the glomeruli appearance of those cells. They're basically knotted up and in a ball, which is similar to what kidney tissue looks like. And then the middle aspect is called the zona fasciculata, and the inner aspect is the zona reticularis. Now, I've always broken this down in my mind to use the acronym GFR, or the glomerular filtration rate. And this is a standard blood study that's done in hospitals to see how somebody's renal function is. So GFR is the way that I always remember it, the outside in, glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis. I hope that helps you. The zona glomerulosa, which is the most external or superficial aspect of the adrenal cortex, is responsible for producing aldosterone, which is a mineral corticoid. And so this has an incredibly important role in affecting our electrolyte composition in body fluids. So it will be responsible for stimulating the conservation of sodium so we can hang on to sodium and help us to eliminate excess potassium ions. Aldosterone also increases our sensitivity to salt receptors, so that way if we are feeling that we are too low in our salt in our body, we will actually crave and want to taste and eat salt more, which helps us to get the salt we need. Aldosterone is also secreted in response to a drop in blood sodium levels, our blood volume, or also our blood pressure. So it's going to basically pop up in a number of different circumstances to be sure that we maintain our electrolyte balance. It also responds to a rise in blood potassium concentration because of the relationship between sodium and potassium. The zona fasciculata is the central aspect of the adrenal cortex, and it's responsible for producing glucocorticoids such as cortisol, corticosterone, and cortisone. And you can imagine those are all important in stress responses. So the secretion of these products is regulated by a negative feedback cycle. And these glucocorticoids will inhibit the production of corticotropin-releasing hormone in the hypothalamus, and also adrenal corticotropic hormone in the anterior pituitary gland, also known as the adenohypophysis. Glucocorticoids are responsible for increasing the speed at which we synthesize glucose and form glycogen, particularly in our hepatocytes or in our liver. And these glucocorticoids have an anti-inflammatory effect. And what an anti-inflammatory effect is really just inhibiting the activities of white blood cells, because that is what's responsible for our inflammatory response. So by having this anti-inflammatory effect, it both inhibits the activities of white blood cells and also helps to address other components of the immune system to dial it back a bit. The zona reticularis is the most inner or most deep aspect of the adrenal cortex, and it's also the smallest, comprising the smallest component of total volume of the adrenal cortex. So the reticularis is a branching network where the endocrine cells form these bands that are very narrow, and this borders right up against the adrenal medulla, which is again controlled by the autonomic nervous system. The zona reticularis will produce some small quantities of androgen under stimulation by adrenocorticotropic hormone. Some of these are going to be converted into estrogens in our bloodstream, and that will help to stimulate the development of pubic hair before puberty actually arises. Figure 1814 is a fantastic study reference for you to review the different areas of the adrenal glands and what is produced where, and then what is the effect of that. So starting at the top, we have the zona glomerulosa, the most outer aspect of the adrenal cortex. And it's going to be producing mineralocorticoids and specifically mostly aldosterone. The target of these hormones go to the kidneys, and then the hormonal effects is that it allows the kidneys to increase renal absorption of sodium and water, specifically in the presence of antidiuretic hormone. And this also allows for us to accelerate urinary loss of potassium. The kidneys also will be stimulated by angiotensin II and elevated blood potassium, or a fall in our blood sodium, and this will be inhibited by our ANP and BNP. Now, the zona fasciculata is the middle level of the adrenal cortex, and this produces glucocorticoids, so specifically cortisol, cortisone, and corticosterone, everything that starts with cort, right? And the targets of these is pretty much everything throughout our body. And the effect of these hormones is that will increase the rate of glucose and glycogen formation by the liver, and it releases amino acids from our skeletal muscles as well as lipids from our adipose tissue. And all these things will help us to use up this energy, and it promotes the utilization of lipids and has anti-inflammatory effects. This is stimulated specifically by adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, as is the zona reticularis. The zona reticularis also secretes androgens specifically. This affects most cells throughout our body, and this can affect our bodies in a widespread fashion, specifically in the sense that adrenal androgens can help us develop pubic hair in boys and girls before they ever reach puberty. And then lastly, at the bottom, we have the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is responsible for secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine because these are involved in our stress response from the sympathetic nervous system. So these are stimulated not by the adrenocorticotropic hormones or anything that is a hormone-related stimulus. These are stimulated specifically by the nervous system by sympathetic preganglionic fibers. And what epinephrine and norepinephrine do, as we know, it allows us to respond quickly, have our heart pound, and get us away from emergencies. So it increases our cardiac activity, it turns up our blood pressure, our glycogen breakdown, so we have sugar in our body, energy to help us actually move. We have our blood glucose levels go up, and it releases lipids from our adipose tissue. In general, epinephrine and norepinephrine help us to produce energy, so that way we have energy to be able to get away from something that is threatening. As we've already discussed, the adrenal medulla will secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. So we have two different types of secretory cells, one that does each specific substance. So epinephrine is about 75 to 80% of our medullary secretion, so that's the vast majority. But the remaining quarter is norepinephrine. When the adrenal medulla is stimulated by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, skeletal muscles will have epinephrine and norepinephrine trigger the mobilization of glycogen and also speed up the breakdown of glucose. So both of these serve to give us immediate energy. Also, it serves to create our stored fats to be broken down into fatty acids, so that way that can be mobilized for rapid energy. Similarly, in the liver, we'll break down glycogen, so that can produce further more energy. And in the heart, stimulating our beta-1 receptors will speed up and strengthen cardiac muscle contractions because we're going to need that extra oxygenation to our distal tissues because our muscles are about to have an increased metabolic demand for both oxygen and glucose. Quick pop quiz question. Adrenal cortex hormones are A, amino acid hormones, B, peptide protein hormones, or C, steroid hormones? Well, if you think, what does the adrenal cortex produce? We know it produces corticosteroids, right? So steroids specifically are correct. The answer is C, steroid hormones. Now let's look at section 18.7, the pineal gland, the one other component of our endocrine system that might actually be smaller than our parathyroid glands. The pineal gland is small but mighty. In the central nervous system, it's in the posterior aspect of the roof of the third ventricle and contains pinealocytes, which are the primary cell type of the pineal gland. So pinealocytes synthesize melatonin, which some of you are probably already familiar with because you may have taken it as a nutritional supplement. Melatonin has a number of different functions, and the first and most commonly known is that it influences our circadian rhythms, which is our sense of day versus nighttime. And so if people are in complete darkness or even just extended darkness, there has been research done that suggests that this is a cause of seasonal affective disorder, which is when people become clinically depressed in the winter due to decreased light exposure. And so this is something that's found to be much more pronounced in places where sunlight is much more rare or short, such as if you have higher latitude, i.e. if you live in Alaska as opposed to somewhere by the equator like in Ecuador. Also, melatonin is important for inhibiting reproductive functions. So some mammals will show that the maturation of their sex cells, specifically sperm and oocytes, as well as their reproductive organs, will actually slow down the maturation of those cells by reducing the rate of gonadotropin-releasing hormone. We don't really know about how this applies to humans in particular yet, though. There's still research being done on this. But there is evidence that shows that melatonin has a role in timing when we start entering puberty. And so the research here is going to show that melatonin in the blood is going to go down at puberty, but if you have a pineal tumor and that area has to be removed from the body, or if it just basically takes that part of the pineal gland out of operation, in that case, that lack of pineal gland production of melatonin can basically cause premature puberty in very young children. And then lastly, another effect of melatonin is that it protects against free radicals. And so free radicals such as nitric oxide or hydrogen peroxide can be really damaging to neurons. So melatonin functions as a very strong antioxidant to protect those cells. Section 18.8, the pancreas. The pancreas is a large and mostly peritoneal gland that has both exocrine and endocrine function. So again, endocrine function goes directly into the bloodstream, whereas exocrine function will secrete a product onto an epithelialized surface, usually a duct. So you can see here in the pancreas, looking at the image below on the left, that there's one main duct that's running horizontally here, and that is the pancreatic duct or the duct of Versun. And so that empties out into the duodenal body at the ampulla of Vater, which is the name for it, which is probably beyond what you need to know for here. But either way, something I want to draw your attention to is if you see that green faint background, that is the common bile duct, and you'll see that it dumps out into the exact same place into the duodenum. So it is for this reason, by the way, that common bile duct, if somebody has a gallstone in their gallbladder and it goes down into that common bile duct to be deposited into the duodenum, if it blocks off the bile from draining into the duodenum, this is how you become jaundiced. So that is one of the indicators of gallstones. But similarly, you can see the location of that common bile duct and how it dumps out into the duodenum. That is called the head of the pancreas. And the head of the pancreas is the location where the majority of malignancies occur. And that is both a mixed blessing because while there are lots of lymph nodes in this area that can be metastasized to, it also has the location of preference in a way, not necessarily clinically, but because you can identify it quickly, because as a tumor grows in this location, it can pinch off the common bile duct, cause jaundice, which is a signal that something is wrong. Whereas if you had a large malignancy off towards in the body of the pancreas, it may not produce any clinical symptoms for quite a period of time, which is one of the reasons why we tend to think of pancreatic cancer as being so deadly. It is. It's one of those things that can grow unbeknownst to us, similar to ovarian cancer, because these are places in our body that are difficult to monitor. So the pancreas is in a loop in between the inferior border of the stomach and then the proximal border of the small intestine, which kind of wraps around in a loop, pretty much like the way you see in this image here. So if you look over at the right at the histologic image, you're going to see that we have pancreatic acini up at the top, and those acini are clusters of exocrine cells which secrete their product into the ducts. But the pancreatic islets that you're looking at here, that's the main component of this image in the pale area in the center, that's going to be responsible for producing our endocrine function. Very briefly, the exocrine pancreas is composed of clusters of glandular cells, and those are called pancreatic acini, which we just saw in the previous image. And that actually takes up about 99% of the pancreatic volume. So the endocrine component is not really taking up that much space at all. So the exocrine pancreas is going to have glandular and duct cells secreting an alkaline, enzyme-rich fluid to be deposited into the duodenum. So it passes through a number of ducts in the pancreas before it drops into a larger duct. It's basically like many streams flowing into a river until it can dump into the digestive tract. The endocrine pancreas, which is the focus of this portion of our lecture, is the area of the pancreas that has cells known as pancreatic islets. And these clusters of cells, also known as islets of Langerhans, produce a number of different products. So we have 4 major cell types in this area, and they each have a different role. There are alpha cells, beta cells, delta cells, and pancreatic polypeptide cells. The alpha cells are responsible for producing glucagon, whereas the beta cells produce insulin, which is obviously very important and has a lot of application in diabetes. The delta cells produce peptides that are pretty much identical to growth hormone inhibiting hormone, and pancreatic polypeptide cells will produce pancreatic polypeptide. The pancreas responds, like many other components of our endocrine system, in a negative feedback loop. So when the blood glucose levels get a little too high, then the beta cells of the pancreas, specifically of the endocrine pancreas, will secrete insulin. And insulin stimulates glucose to be transported into target cells and taken up. But when blood glucose level gets too low, then the alpha cells of our endocrine pancreas, they launch into gear and they secrete glucagon. And that glucagon will stimulate glycogen breakdown and glucose release by the liver. Figure 1817 is showing you how homeostasis is restored in one of 2 different ways through the alpha cells and the beta cells of the pancreatic islets in the pancreas. So starting off on the left part of this image, let's look at how homeostasis is disturbed by too high of a blood glucose level. So in that case, what happens is the beta cells in the pancreatic islets will recognize this elevated blood glucose level, and as a result, they will secrete their product, which is insulin. So insulin then affects all body cells. So all of our body cells can respond in a number of ways. They can increase the rate of glucose that's transported into the cells and increase the rate of glucose use and ATP generation using up glucose. Also, this can increase conversion of glucose to glycogen for storage and increase amino acid absorption and protein synthesis. And lastly, to increase triglycerides or fats synthesis in adipose tissue, which is yet again another storage for excess glucose. So through this mechanism, we're able to restore homeostasis from elevated blood glucose. But now, if we have the opposite thing happen, if we have, starting on the left again at the bottom, if our homeostasis is disturbed because our blood glucose level is too low, then we need to get that blood glucose level back up to give us the energy that we need. So the stimulus here affects the receptors, which are the alpha cells in the pancreatic islets, and the alpha cells then secrete their product, which is glucagon. Glucagon will affect our liver, our skeletal muscles, as well as our adipose tissue. And the response to that is that we have increased breakdown of glycogen to glucose, so that yields more glucose, and that occurs in the liver as well as in the skeletal muscle. We also respond by breaking down fat into fatty acids, creating, yet again, more energy. And lastly, it will increase synthesis and release of glucose in the liver. So in general, that glucagon is going to allow our body to produce all sorts of glucose, so that way we can restore our blood glucose level back up to a homeostatic level. As we just discussed, insulin is a peptide hormone. It's released by beta cells of the endocrine pancreas, and the effect on the target cells is to accelerate glucose uptake, accelerate glucose use, enhance ATP production, stimulate our glycogen formation, and also stimulate amino acid absorption and protein synthesis, and lastly, to stimulate triglyceride formation in adipocytes. Glucagon has the opposite effect of insulin. It is mobilizing our energy reserves to give us more energy, as opposed to insulin, which allows us to store energy. So glucagon is going to be released by the alpha cells as opposed to the beta cells releasing insulin. And these alpha cells will then have the glucagon affect target cells, so that way we can break down glycogen in skeletal muscle, as well as also in liver cells, and to stimulate the breakdown of triglycerides, creating energy, and also stimulating the production and release of glucose in the liver cells, which is gluconeogenesis. So altogether, glucagon is helping us to produce more glucose. So glucagon obviously would be important if our blood glucose levels got too low, whereas insulin is important when the opposite is true, when it gets too high. Hyperglycemia is the term that we use for having elevated glucose levels in the blood that are abnormal. Hyper meaning elevated, glyce meaning sugar or glucose, and emia meaning blood. So high blood sugar is literally the translation of hyperglycemia. And this is characterized often by diabetes mellitus, which is defined more or less by high glucose concentrations that overwhelm the abilities of our kidneys to manage it. So what happens in this case is you'll find glucose present in urine, which is not normally going to be identified in most healthy people. And you'll also see something called polyuria, poly meaning multiple or frequent, and uria being urination. So in other words, it requires people to urinate frequently because as they're urinating out that excess glucose. Diabetes mellitus is broken down to two different types, type 1 and type 2. Type 2 is probably what you're most familiar with because it is the most common type that you see in the United States. Type 1 diabetes mellitus used to be known as childhood diabetes, but it's not entirely always true. But diabetes mellitus type 1 is caused by an inadequate insulin production by our pancreatic beta cells, which would produce insulin. And so in this case, when you have that inadequate insulin, we need to have patients inject themselves daily and even more often than just once a day, so they have a continuous infusion of insulin to prevent getting hypoglycemic. Only about 5% of diabetes mellitus cases are type 1, and this is usually going to be found in children and young adults. Now, type 2 diabetes mellitus is becoming much more common in children and young adults, especially as our obesity epidemic has become very serious in the United States. So just keep in mind, if you see a child and they have diabetes mellitus, don't necessarily assume that it's type 1 diabetes mellitus. It could be type 2. So type 2 is when you normally have a normal amount of insulin produced, but after a while you become insulin resistant, meaning that the tissues don't respond properly to insulin. And so one of the things that can help to treat diabetes mellitus, type 2 specifically, can be weight loss. However, weight loss will have little to no effect whatsoever on type 1 diabetes mellitus because in type 1, they do not have adequate insulin production at all. It's not that the tissues aren't responding, the insulin just isn't going to be produced. So losing weight will have pretty much no effect on type 1 diabetes mellitus. The consequences of diabetes mellitus that is either untreated or not managed properly can be very dire, and unfortunately, some of these things occur without a lot of warning necessarily. So if you're not managing it properly on the regular, you can be having a number of different things occurring just subclinically beyond your ability to detect it until it becomes a serious problem that may require surgical repair or not be able to be repaired at all. So one such thing that can happen is our kidneys can degenerate, and that is a huge issue, obviously, for obvious reasons. That could result in the need for a renal transplant. Also, retinal damage occurs via diabetic retinopathy, and this is when we have blood vessels that grow into the retina that should not be present, that can obscure your vision, causing blindness. And this is actually the leading cause of blindness in adults in the United States. Also, you can have a heart attack very young. In fact, people with diabetes are likely to have heart attacks or myocardial infarctions at a rate of 3 to 5 times the regular population. Also, peripheral nerve problems are very common, such as diabetic neuropathies. and peripheral tissue damage due to reduced blood flow. And this leads to a whole gamut of issues. This is something my husband works with regularly in interventional radiology, when people who have diabetes will unfortunately end up having an occlusion to blood flow in their leg, which, if you live in a rural area like where I'm from in Northern Ontario, that would result in an amputation because the tissue would die distal to that occlusion due to hypoxia and no blood flow getting to the area. But now we actually have treatments that if somebody is able to get into a hospital and get evaluated and treated in time, there are interventions that can allow TPA, which is tissue plasminogen activating factor, to be literally dropped via an IV drop directly onto the site of where that clot is to break it down, and it most of the time is able to actually break down that blood clot and then restore blood flow to the distal limb, preventing the need for amputation. But it is not absolutely guaranteed, and timing is everything in this sort of situation. Pop quiz time. Which hormone decreases blood glucose? A, glucagon, B, insulin, C, norepinephrine or epinephrine, and D, cortisol. I'm hoping at this point you're ruling out C and D right away and recognizing those as obvious decoys. So you need to break it down into either glucagon or insulin. And glucagon is going to help to create more blood glucose, whereas insulin is going to help us when we have excessive blood glucose. So insulin is basically generated in response to a meal, in response to elevated blood glucose. So insulin is responsible for decreasing blood glucose. The answer is B. Section 18.9, secondary endocrine functions. Throughout our body, we have the endocrine system, which we've just discussed, and all of those primary organs. But there are also organs that have their own individual function, that have a secondary function that is endocrine. And this includes the intestines, which are part of the digestive system, the kidneys, part of the urinary system, the heart, the major component of the cardiovascular system, the thymus, which is a component of the lymphatic system, and the gonads, which are part of the reproductive systems. Intestines are part of the digestive system that are responsible for processing and absorbing nutrients, but they also release hormones that will be responsible for coordinating a number of different digestive activities. The kidneys will release hormones called calcitriol and erythropoietin. And calcitriol is important for stimulating calcium and phosphate absorption in the digestive tract. Erythropoietin is going to be important for producing red blood cells. So these will release the enzyme renin. And when the kidneys release renin, this has an important role in our blood pressure. And you're going to discuss this when you do the renal system in 206. But renin will convert angiotensin into angiotensin 1. And then as that processes through the bloodstream, the lungs will be able to convert this via angiotensin converting factor into angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Figure 1819 shows you how our kidneys respond to variation in blood pressure and volume, and this uses the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So starting off on the left, if our homeostasis is disturbed by decreased blood pressure and volume, our kidneys will be able to recognize this because there's decreased blood flow coming into the kidneys via the renal artery, and therefore decreased oxygenation to the renal tissues. So as a result, the endocrine response of the kidney is to release erythropoietin, and erythropoietin produces erythrocytes, red blood cells. And so that allows us to produce more red blood cells. But also, the endocrine response of the kidneys is to release renin. And renin has a complicated path by which first renin will end up converting angiotensin, which is a plasma protein, into angiotensin 1. But then once the bloodstream has carried this around up to the capillaries of the lungs, angiotensin converting enzyme can take angiotensin 1 and convert it into the hormone angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is responsible for stimulating aldosterone secretion from our adrenal cortex, as well as antidiuretic hormone from our neurohypophysis or posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So together, aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone will help us to retain salt and water by preventing the kidneys from excreting it. Angiotensin 2 is also going to help us to stimulate our thirst and elevate our blood pressure. So you've probably heard of drugs known as ACE inhibitors, and those are used to treat hypertension, specifically because what those drugs do is they inhibit the effect of angiotensin converting enzyme, and this causes vasodilation. And so by increasing dilation of the blood vessels, you bypass this whole entire system that we see in this image entirely, because you would stop at the red box labeled homeostasis disturbed by, because we wouldn't have decreased blood pressure and volume as perceived by the kidney, because due to vasodilation, we would have adequate blood flow and adequate oxygenation to the kidneys via the renal artery, and therefore this whole entire cascade wouldn't even need to occur in the first point. The heart also has a secondary endocrine function. And so what happens in the heart is that natriuretic peptides ANP and BNP can be produced whenever the blood volume becomes excessive. And these actions are going to be exactly in the opposite effect of angiotensin II. So the result of these natriuretic peptides is to reduce the blood volume and also to lower blood pressure. The thymus has another secondary function, that's endocrine, and the thymus will produce thymosin, which is a blend of a number of different hormones, but together what they do is they'll promote the development of the maturation of lymphocytes so that we can have a developed immune response. In addition to producing sex cells or sperm cells, testes have a secondary endocrine function as well. So these gonads will have interstitial endocrine cells that produce androgens, and androgens are important in both female and male bodies, but particularly in male bodies, because testosterone is an important element of this. There are nurse cells, which are supportive cells to the main cells of the testes, and these nurse cells are also known as Sertoli cells. So the nurse cells will help to basically nurse and support the other maturing cells so that they can mature properly and differentiate into mature, proper sperm cells. Nurse cells also, though, secrete inhibin, and inhibin inhibits the secretion of follicular stimulating hormone at the adenohypophysis, and also may potentially suppress gonadotropin-releasing hormone at the hypothalamic level. In addition to producing ova, the ovaries have a role in secondary endocrine function as well, and that is to produce estrogen, and specifically estradiol. So after ovulation, what happens is the follicle cells, which surround the developing ovum, will reorganize themselves into what you see at the bottom of the image here as labeled as an early corpus luteum. And so once that's reorganized, you'll see how it gets bigger to the left, and that's because it is full of hormones. So it's releasing estrogens and progesterone. So side note, I did in vitro fertilization to have my son Ezra, and in that process, a number of different eggs are all extracted from the ovary at the same time. In fact, they try to extract as many as possible. So anything that's developing reasonably well is going to be extracted. And so you have none of these remaining follicles after this procedure is over. So as a result, the corpus luteum doesn't develop, which means we don't have the release of estrogen and progesterone at the level that we would in a normal pregnancy. So as a result, we need to supplement that, because progesterone in particular has a very important role in maintaining a healthy placenta until the placenta generates itself. So for the first 10 weeks of pregnancy, I had to supplement progesterone by injections, which are awful. I can tell you all about that later. But nonetheless, to supplement progesterone to maintain the placenta up until the 10th week, when it became producing that on its own. We're going to discuss this a whole lot more when we get into the reproductive chapter. Also, our adipose tissue, which we normally don't think of as anything other than excess weight to carry around, has a secondary endocrine function as well. It produces leptin, which is a peptide hormone, and its role is to help maintain our control of our appetites. So they first discovered this when a number of obese mice in a laboratory were discovered to have a defective leptin gene. So they treated these mice with leptin, and then very quickly the mice lost their appetites and became normal, healthy, athletic-looking mice. And so leptin is known for maintaining our normal levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and gonadotropin synthesis. Section 1810, Hormone Interactions. Sometimes you'll see interactions become kind of complicated. So for example, a cell might receive instructions from not just one hormone at a time, but it might receive instructions from a number of hormones at the same time. So when we have two different hormones interacting at the same site, one of four different things could happen. The first is we could have an antagonistic effect, and that is based upon whether we have a balance between the two hormones. we have a synergistic effect in which the two different hormones add up together to create a stronger effect together as a team. Or we could have a permissive effect in which one hormone is required for the other one to actually become effective. So one is basically an enabler. Or we could have the integrative effect, in which we have different effects, but the overall outcome is still complementary towards the same end. There are several endocrine hormones that will work together to be able to allow us to grow normally. The first is growth hormone, which is responsible for protein synthesis and cellular growth, specifically in children. So this helps for children to have their muscular system and their skeleton to grow appropriately. Thyroid hormones produced by the thyroid are responsible for a number of different things, but specifically in development, both fetal and just perinatal, in that first year after birth, if there are no thyroid hormones present, then the nervous system won't develop properly, and as a result, there will be developmental delay. Insulin is also important for passing glucose and amino acids across the plasma membranes, and so without insulin, that passage of glucose or amino acids will stop or become completely reduced. Parathyroid hormones and calcitriol have an important role in promoting calcium absorption from the bloodstream into the bone. So without the levels of both of these being appropriate, then what will happen is we'll still grow, we'll still have normal sized bones, but the problem is that the bones won't have appropriate calcium deposition into it, meaning they'll become poorly mineralized and really soft and bendy. So if they become soft and bendy and flexible, it's kind of like Gumby, if you have ever seen that cartoon. But rickets is a response to this, in which you have bones that grow to be a normal size. However, because of vitamin D deficiency, they're not properly mineralized, and then they bend under body weight, so they bend laterally. And then the last is we have reproductive hormones. And reproductive hormones have a number of different effects stimulating cell growth and differentiation in all sorts of different target tissues, varying upon the specific actual hormone. So let's look at each of these hormones just in summary. So growth hormone is responsible in children for developing our muscular system and our skeletal development. And for adults, it's going to help us to maintain normal blood glucose concentrations and allow us to mobilize our lipid reserves for energy when needed. Thyroid hormones are so important that if they're absent in the perinatal period of development, the nervous system won't develop properly, and as a result, developmental delay will occur. Now, if T4 concentrations decline before puberty, normal skeletal development will not continue. So you can see people with diminished stature as a result of this. Insulin allows for glucose and amino acids to cross across plasma membranes, and this is important for cells to be able to grow. Parathyroid hormone and calcitriol will both allow for calcium salts to be absorbed from the bloodstream to be deposited into bone so that the mineralization of bone makes our bones strong. So without adequate calcium deposition into the bone, we end up with weak, flexible bones that can bend and even sometimes break. The effects of reproductive hormones vary. There are androgens that have a primary role in males and estrogens in females, and these will stimulate cell growth and differentiation in a variety of target tissues. They also produce gender-related differences in both our skeletal proportions, which is why males are typically larger than females, and also why we have secondary sex characteristics that differ from males to females. All right, let's talk about stress. And not that I need to tell you anything about stress you don't already know, but in terms of hormone interactions, stress is considered to be a condition that threatens our homeostasis. General adaptation syndrome is also called our stress response, and this is just how our body responds to stress-causing factors. So we'll break it down into 3 different phases. The first is the alarm phase, the second is our resistance, and the third is when you're just tuckered out, and the exhaustion phase. In general adaptation syndrome, the first phase is the alarm phase. So this is when we immediately respond to and recognize a stressor. So this will be directed by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, which through sympathetic stimulation will then stimulate the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. And this allows us to respond via the fight or flight response. Epinephrine is going to be the dominant hormone that drives the alarm phase. The second phase of the general adaptation syndrome is the resistance phase. And this occurs if the stressor lasts for more than a few hours, and it can even extend for periods of time as long as weeks or even up to months. In this case, glucocorticoids will be the dominant hormones involved, and in this period of time, lipids and amino acids will be mobilized for energy, and glucose will be conserved for use by nervous tissue, where the nervous tissue has high demand for glucose that cannot be denied. The last stage in the general adaptation syndrome is the exhaustion phase, and this is when our whole attempt to return back to homeostasis breaks down. And when that occurs, we'll have a drop in potassium levels due to aldosterone being produced at this phase in time. And at this point, we have a failure of one or more organ systems. And if that occurs, then that results in death. We've already described how hormone changes can affect behavior, specifically in regarding to stress. But we can also have our behavior be affected by hormone changes, including changes to our intellectual capacity, memory, learning, and emotional state, all as a result of all of these hormone changes. Further, even if we have normal changes in our circulating hormone levels, these can cause behavioral changes. So an example in your textbook is precocious puberty, is when puberty occurs at an extremely early age. So at this point, what happens is sex hormones will be produced extremely early, sometimes with children as young as 5 or 6 years old. So when 5 or 6-year-olds get these sex hormones in their body, many things change. In addition to changing their body and secondary sex characteristics, they also have behavioral changes. So one of the things that occurs is that instead of being an easygoing, agreeable little kid, they basically have the effects of being an adolescent occurring while they're children. So what that means is they end up becoming more aggressive, more assertive, they might fight with other children more. All sorts of these things can happen. And typically, we see this sort of behavior arise in adolescence with teenagers as they first enter puberty because they're becoming accustomed to having all of these new hormones flooding their central nervous system. But it appears, though, that this occurs with children when they have precocious puberty. So it's not so much just a situational effect of peer pressure and environmental stimuli as it is actually having a physiologic basis. There are also a few functional changes that occur with age. So over time, our reproductive hormones will decline in concentration, particularly as you can see in andropause and menopause. And there are some endocrine tissues that will become less responsive to stimulation over time. Thank you all for your attention today. You guys are doing absolutely fantastic in this course, and I'm so proud of you. Please reach out to me, as always. If you'd like to talk, I am always available to Zoom. Thanks again, guys. Have a great week.